Hello and welcome to today's 18 Group webinar on ESG, a growth opportunity and a regulatory challenge. My name's Sarah Underwood, I'm an editor here, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Our expert speakers are Monica Filkova, Climate and Nature Investment Risk Lead in the Chief Investment Office at Aviva, Dara Tracy, Senior Strategy Manager at Fenergo, Sean Taylor, Intermediaries Director at Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management, and Sean Vickers, CEO at Aurora. I'll ask them all to introduce themselves in just a moment, but first, so that you can make best use of the webinar, to the right of your video screen, you'll see a Slido area. There's an area for polls and an area for questions. We'll be running 3 polls during the webinar, so do please vote. Always good to hear your views on what we're talking about and where you are in the process of developing your ESG. In the other side, you can put your questions for our speakers, put them in anytime you like, and we'll gather them together and put them to our speakers before the close of the webinar. So any questions in there and polls in the other column. That's enough from me for the time being. And let me come to Monica. Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your interest here.
Thank you for having me. So my name is Monica Filkova, and my role within Aviva is on the asset owner side. It's effectively looking at how, as an asset owner, we can meet regulatory requirements and protect our investments for our customers, and that includes incorporating climate and nature investment risk into investment decision making, and collaborating with other parts of the group in reflecting sustainability aspects in our external reporting and communications.
Excellent, thank you. Over to you, Dara.
Thanks, Sarah. So, hi, folks. My name is Dara Tracy. I'm a Senior Strategy Manager at Fenergo. So, Fenergo is a solution provider in client lifecycle management. So, we help financial institutions do 2 main things, really: interpret complex regulatory and standard obligations in areas like ESG, in KYC, in market regs for things like Dodd-Frank and MiFID and so on. And then we use our technology to make that as easy and lightweight a process as possible. So my particular area of specialization is ESG. So over the last couple of years, we've been working with our clients to basically tackle this big, weighty monster coming down the tracks called ESG and what it means for them and for their clients. So I'll be talking through a bit of that today, and looking forward to the session. Lovely, thank you. Over to you, Sean Taylor.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to be here, Sarah. Thank you very much for the invite. I'm on the intermediary side of Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management, and I guess I'm here because we're a very early adopter of ESG. We build bespoke and managed portfolio service solutions, and I'm here to talk about the business, the business side of ESG, and help that way. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sean, over to you. So I should say Sean Vickers.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Sean Vickers, I'm the CEO at Aurora. We are a financial consultant that specializes solely in client lifecycle management, and that's everything from pre-trade right through to exit. ESG is an incredibly important topic for the clients that we work with across financial institutions. So I'm happy to be here today to talk a little bit more around the macro environment and what we're seeing in the market.
Excellent. Great expertise in the room, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion. So let's start that off, though, with an audience poll question, which says, how prepared is your organization to meet its ESG obligations? So if you'd all like to vote in that poll, while you do that, let me come, if I can, to Dara, please, to talk a little bit about the ESG regulatory landscape, what's going on out there.
Sure. So if we think about ESG and compare it to something like KYC, it's at a much earlier stage of maturity than KYC. It's sort of where KYC was about 10 years ago. So the regulatory landscape is changing. There's been some published legislations like the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and Sustainable Finance Direct Regulation out of the EU that have set the pace to a certain extent. Those are in effect now. There will be extensions to them. And then there have been other standards that have been published, like TCFD, like GRI, like the United Nations Global Compact, which various firms and nations are adapting to. TCFD in particular is a popular one, but both in terms of the kind of end state of those regulations and standards, and also in terms of how institutions adapt to those. It's pretty early days, it's still a new world out there. Firms are figuring out what their own ESG policy is, how they're going to make that work within their organization. And then there's big changes coming down the path with SEC guidelines, which are coming out later this year once they eventually make through the houses of Congress over there, with some resistance due to the politicalization of ESG in that country, as well as the International Sustainability Standards Board's guidelines, which a couple of months ago just confirmed that they would start to take effect at January 1st. That's another standard that will apply. So, a huge amount of acronyms out there, an awful lot of obligations to meet for large financial institutions, and then a mixture also of standards that they can adopt as well. So it's I suppose a chaotic place, but and one that will get more complicated.
Thank you, Dara. Sean, you're a practitioner. How do you see it as it sort of heads its way your way?
Well, I think it's a bit like one of those sports matches which starts off really slowly and gets quite frantic as time's gone on. And I think it was accelerated. The regulatory landscape for ESG has accelerated during and post-pandemic. I think that is a key pivot point. It was a sort of a nice to have, but I think we've seen the massive growth and why there needs to be regulatory control and practices put into place is that we've seen a massive rise of, particularly of shareholder activism. The buyers of ESG, the users of ESG, no longer want to invest in companies that just aren't very nice or doing the right thing. And I think there's been this concentration look through, and I'm sure some of my other panel members today are far better placed to comment on it. But it is now so high on the agenda, and that was then accentuated further by an event that's still very live in our minds, and that was when the Russians invaded Ukraine in 22, in that ESG then, we knew it as environmental, social and governance, all of a sudden ESG became about energy security and guns. So we have that slight dichotomy there that actually is like, oh no, this really is important. And I think we've now got a mixture in the regulatory landscape of as Dara quite rightly put, a mandatory piece coming down from world organizations. We've got disclosure frameworks. We've got stewardship codes about how companies are run. We've got the green finance aspect of it to make sure that we're not greenwashing. And this landscape, the regulatory landscape, is massively dynamic. It's not going to stop tomorrow. And I think every day it is changing. Is that okay, Sarah?
Yeah, that's fine. I can't think any differently, to be honest. Okay, let's see those poll results if we may. And Dara, would you like to comment on these? Yes, well, yes, not bad. What do you think, Dara?
Yeah, I'd say that.
Oh, can we have them back?
I think I saw it there, or it
okay.
disappeared. Yes, majority somewhat prepared. I'd say that aligns with what we're seeing talking to clients. I mean, just 10% is fully prepared. These are, that's very common refrain that we hear from talking to clients, that these are regulations that are in effect. This is an ongoing concern, as Sean says. Some of this is related to the war in Ukraine that's going on today. So there's an element of catching up with that, of trying to figure out what exactly do we do, both from a regulatory perspective, but also what do our customers expect? People want to do business with firms whose values align with their own. So figuring out what good looks like in this space is tough. Getting through all of those regulations and standards, figuring out a policy that works, and then figuring out an operating model that works for the institution is tough. So yeah, this doesn't surprise me, unfortunately.
Okay, no, I don't think it should. There's so much to do still, isn't there? So yeah, being somewhere on the journey has to be a good thing. Okay, Sean Taylor, coming back to you, looking at that regulatory landscape, how can financial institutions make ESG a growth opportunity? As you said, it's quite chaotic at the moment. There's an awful lot going on. Where is the growth opportunity?
Yeah, I was surprised at those numbers. Actually, I thought more would have said that they were fully prepared, because this is on the agenda. It's not going anywhere, and users are demanding it. And let's not forget that if we take each of the separate parts of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, There are so many strands that we see in everyday life that are coming together, particularly around the social and the governance. You've got diversity in there, you've got gender mix, and as I said, the shareholder activism, you've got the climate piece. It's all pulling all of those strands together. And I would like to point out, it's not about being woke. It's about people and planet. Those are the two things. So when you boil it down to people and planet, where's the growth opportunity? And I think that's the piece that we're looking at there, is that by integrating and dealing particularly with the data flows, it's actually knowing your data, it's knowing your business. Knowing where you're investing for a client, or knowing what the client wants to invest into, and helps you then develop products and services that are right for the client. And I think we're going to arrive very soon that ESG may actually just disappear it'll always be around because of the climate piece. And we hear about Green Finance Initiative and net zero that's coming through in the City of London next week. But the UK is particularly leading on this. We've got to be careful not to lose that lead as a growth opportunity. But if a company can evidence, and that evidence has got to be data driven, that they are at least attempting or dealing or can deliver on each of those strands of the E, the S, and the G, that should naturally attract people to actually, oh, well, what does your company do? How does it do it? Can you do this? Can you provide that for me? And I think that's the apart from developing just pure products and services, that's a real what sort of aphrodisiac, I think, is it draws people in, is that you're doing things properly. And I know that sounds really odd about doing things properly, but if you also, to Dara's point and Sean's point, is that if you are like KYC, you're doing your due diligence properly, where you're investing and what you are doing, and therefore that's a great discussion point with clients, and say, I know that this board of this particular company has a minimum of 30% of women on its board. It has gender and it has diversity. It treats its staff well. They take their, topically we spoke earlier that, mental health, it has a mental health policy, but also they're not just destroying the environment by the product and the service that they do. That will make the investor, if it's an investable company, make it very comfortable that actually, because you ask that very open and leading question of somebody, do you want to do the right thing? Most people will say yes, because people like to do the right thing. Sarah, back to you.
Fair enough. Sean Vickers, what would you add there in terms of finding the growth opportunity?
Yeah, I think they're great points, Sean. There's twofold, I think, because I think I want to talk about the other component of growth, which is for many organizations, when it comes to culture and leadership, actually, as those organizations try to attract talent, they are going to look at organizations where there is an element of greenwashing and there isn't corporate hypocrisy, because there is a direct correlation between that kind of corporate greenwashing and work engagement. So actually, from getting the right people and attracting the right talent, ESG is the right way to go about this. And you touched on something else, Sean, that I'd like to talk about, which is competitive advantage. Because actually, the flip side of competitive advantage is competitive disadvantage. And I actually think if people don't tackle and look at ESG in the right way, and certainly in the world that I and Dara spend a lot of time occupying ourselves, which is onboarding and KYC, if it's not approached as a form of growth and differentiation, banks will fall behind other banks and organizations will fall behind other organizations. Why is that? Because often we measure things like onboarding around turnaround time and quality and the amount of time that we touch a client when we're trying to do outreach. ESG will make that more complicated. So if you don't do anything, you are ergo making a process more complicated. So by leading in with a digital story and doing this in the right way, you get growth and you can drive a story around competitive advantage, which I think is the two pluses there.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Monica, what would you like to add?
Well, there's actually another aspect to it, I think, because where I think a lot of the opportunities are in thinking about sustainability more broadly. So a lot of the initial thinking in the space was what would impact a company, be that a production company or a bank or an insurance company. And that's where ESG essentially grew up. And regulation now is actually much broader than that. The CSRD that was mentioned earlier is asking for dual materiality. It's asking how would what's happening in terms of climate change, what's happening in society impact your business model. And yes, competitiveness automatically comes into play, but it's also about risk if you're a financial institution. But it's also what is your impact, and to the point that Sean Taylor mentioned earlier, that therein lies the opportunity. Indeed, it does. But in terms of regulation, there's actually two levels. There's one, what is the entity doing? But there's also when financial institutions create a product or a service, is it marketing it appropriately? Is it appropriately interpreting what's behind that product? And that's where there is that great need for company reported information. So in the sticking with the EU example, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation is about identifying, will the investments in your fund have an impact? Is that the objective, or is it a few aspects of sustainability and ESG that are being taken into account? In the UK, likewise, the regulator is consulting on labelling. That links to the point about greenwashing. So actually, when we talk about regulation and how it links to sustainability, there's always those two levels, the companies and those that provide capital to those companies. And that's not necessarily the same position. It is related, but it's not necessarily the same position. And increasing disclosure regulation for companies is effectively meant to enable the financial institutions to be able to offer better products, more robust products to their customers. So I think that bears stressing in terms of where we're coming from and where we are in the evolution of the space.
I mean, Monica brings up a very good point there, Sarah, in that yeah, sometimes we can, particularly on a discussion like this, we can sometimes externalize ESG a bit and about, oh, well, we're doing this and we're watching about the green sheen, as I call it. It all looks terribly shiny, but it probably isn't underneath. You sort of scratch away at the paint. But actually, there's the internal piece as well. So you have to make sure that, you know, not only are you talking the talk, but you're walking the walk. And I think that's where, with especially, you know, as Monica pointed out, with SFDR and the other regulations coming down, especially net zero, that people aren't just saying, oh, look at me, I've got the green badge. And actually, they're not living those ideals. And that, again, answers to Sean Vickers's point about, it will be, we are definitely at that pivot point, and the expectations of the people of investors and employees is so critical now to what the future will hold. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And let's run another poll question here, and it asks, what are the challenges of compliance with ESG regulation at your organization? And I feel sure you have more than one, so you can tick as many of the boxes as you like. And while you do that, I'm going to come back to Monica to talk about the challenges of compliance and how she sees them changing over time.
I think the fact that there's regulation is good and bad. It's good because it raises the bar and creates a more level playing field. But the challenge comes in the form of different jurisdictions developing different regulations. If you operate in multiple markets, you need to coordinate. But it's not just that. The TCFD framework was mentioned earlier. TCFD is a principles-based framework. It doesn't tell you exactly what you need to disclose. It tells you the topic. It tells you what things you need to think about. but there is a level of freedom around how you disclose. That then creates a bit of a challenge on what do you disclose, what is most material to disclose, and how do you balance that out potentially across different bits of regulation. I think the other element is, again, as mentioned previously, there's a lot more coming down the track. The International Sustainability Standards Board is working with IFRS on 2 sustainability standards. Within the EU, there is the European standards around sustainability that cover a number of topics. The SEC is expected to come through with a rule. Now, all of these consultations will ultimately result in something. We may not know exactly what it is, but we do know it's coming down the track. So how do you balance out starting to build up capacity to be able to report under these incoming regulations with the regulations you've already got in place? I think in the UK, we, as an insurance company that has an investment business, are now required by the FCA to produce product reports, so fund level reports. It's not just about group level, it's not about the entities within the group, it's about the funds. And effectively moving the TCFD disclosure to fund level. So there's always something. Being able to horizon scan effectively and to think through how you address the different requirements of different regulators, I think is one of those key challenges we face.
Okay, lovely. Dara, what do you see when you're out in the market? Where are the sticking points and how do you see that changing?
Yeah, I'd say 2 things. I just add to Monica's point, I agree with everything she said there, and just the adaptability in a time when there is so much change and new regulations threatened all the time from the SEC or ISSB or changes to some of the existing EU regulations. You know, a financial institution may know what they want to do and that they're happy that they've met their obligations. That's going to change in 6 months and it's going to change in another 6 months. So being able to just adapt to that quickly and consume those changes in a way that doesn't completely upset the operating model is tough, you know, both from a technology perspective and also from a team training, change management perspective as well. So just, yeah, that horizon scanning, staying on top of those obligations is a challenge for a lot of institutions. The other one I would say, just going back to Sean's point, is executing net zero or just making it meaningful, you know, so connecting like an executive level pledge. You know, Mark Carney, as part of this GFANS group, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, if I'm not getting my acronyms wrong. That's a consortium of groups with about 130 trillion, although I'm sure it's more now, dollars under management. But when a group like that makes a pledge, what does that actually mean for somebody who's dealing with the client face to face? You know, and just building a traceable, data-driven connection between those boardroom pledges and how we interact with clients on the ground can be a challenge as well. Because otherwise, it ends up just being hot air to a certain extent, and it's just something that firms feel they need to say, but actually the activities don't really change. So a huge amount is saying, well, actually, if we want to be the greenest bank in the world or the most socially responsible bank in the world, or there's a specific industry that we no longer want to do business with, how do we then decompose that into something that we can then action with our teams, that we can then communicate with our clients and start working towards some transition planning and divestment planning? So that can be quite an involved process, but that's what makes ESG real, and that's what gives them something they can stand over.
Okay, great. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah.
May we see those next poll results, please? And Monica, having answered that question, what would you think to that? Oh, that's a common complaint there, the lack of formal data standards. What would you say?
I think people get overly focused on data. Yes, we absolutely need data. But just because you can measure something doesn't mean you can compare it. So if you take a common metric, which is emissions, unless you know exactly what's in scope of what's measured. So for example, from our point of view, what asset classes, which funds, you can't really compare it to somebody else. I think one of the challenges with data, as stated, is usually we don't have it. But I think even if you do have it, There needs to be a lot more consideration in how data is being used. Is it really comparable? What are you actually saying with the data? Is it telling a story, or are you just putting the data there because everybody else is? So I think where the market is at, the market in general is still grappling with having the right data. And sometimes opportunities are missed to actually tell the story that sits behind the data. But yes, I'm not surprised by having data at the top of the list.
Okay, fine. Anybody else like to comment on those in terms of what they would expect?
Just add on the data challenge there. That yeah, I mean, data is a huge part of it. So both at the entity level. So, you know, if we say, okay, well, we're going to be compliant with this set of standards or regulations, we have our policy defined. How do we get that data? You know, can we source it automatically from a third party? Are we going to outreach to clients who start leveraging our digital strategy and do some kind of portal outreach? And that's before you start getting into some of the trickier stuff around scope 3 emissions, and you're starting to interrogate supply chains, which really just blows up the amount of data that's required. So both in terms of what that standard is and then how we complete that data is a key area.
Okay, thank you. And if you missed Dara's comment on groups that are organising to help with this, I think the one he mentioned was the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There are others. There are many others, in fact.
But he won't come and talk to you unless you've got £150,000 to spend. There you go.
Okay.
And that doesn't include his flights. So I wonder how that goes against net zero.
There you go. But look around if you're interested in some of these groups. There are a number around who are trying to support asset managers and so on. So that's still one source of help if you need it. Okay, let's move on. And back to you, Dara. And what types of technologies, solutions, and services are particularly helpful here? There's an awful lot a lot of plates spinning. How can you help?
Yeah, so I suppose from a technology perspective, the areas that technology can really help, and one of the areas that we help our clients with is managing those obligations. Really, so you know, if we have a client and we have a relationship, what do we need to do? So we have a European-based client, or we have a client that's based in Japan or that's based in the United States. And what should ESG look like specific to that region, to that business line, to that client type, from a scoping perspective? And then how do we go about making that as simple, as lightweight a process as can be? And Sean will have a lot of experience with this from the KYC part of CLM. It actually shares an awful lot of DNA with that. So we have the set of obligations that we have against our clients. We want to understand them more deeply. Well, what does that look like from a standard perspective? And then how do we go about gathering that data? So that harks back to what I was just saying there around some of the automation. So, you know, there's a huge amount of providers out there who will supply some of that information. So there's MSCI and Bloomberg and Sustainalytics and RepRisk and these. So how can we leverage those from a technology perspective to pre-populate as much of that data as possible? Because the data challenge is huge. You know, the amount of data that's required for ESG can grow quite large if it's not managed, and then getting that information can be a challenge. And then for the additional piece, technology can help with the digitization of that. So oftentimes part of the answer of that due diligence is outreach. So we go directly to the client and say, hey, we need to know what the makeup of your board is. We need to know what your emissions were last year. Can you give us this information? And again, that shares a lot of DNA with KYC, where we're managing the client relationship through that journey in as user-friendly and as customer-friendly a way as we can.
Okay, Sean Vickers, where are you with the technology solutions and things like that? Are you using stuff like that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, and I kind of dovetail off the back of something that Dara mentioned, and I'll come back to something that Monica said around data. So from a kind of consulting perspective and what we're seeing on an advisory basis, there's certainly technology around the CLM onboarding story, as Dara has referenced, for managing obligations. You know, there is downstream consumption, there is regulatory reporting, there is client reporting. So as those platforms step in, you continue to drive competitive advantage, and you continue to remove, you know, processes that are not particularly efficient. So we can see certainly something around CLM. I'm also seeing quite a lot around data mastering and data provisioning. And what I mean by that is, yes, data is just data, but what we're seeing is vendors in the market who are driving around 3 use cases. So the first one is around sustainable data. So side-by-side comparisons, composite metrics from a broad range of ESG data providers and ESG factors. So we're seeing vendors in the market start to tackle the challenge that Monica has mentioned, which is there's a lot of data. Is it all equal? How does it weight? So we're seeing that's one use case. We're seeing a lot around data creation, portfolio creation and tuning. So again, that aggregation from investment to portfolio level. But finally, we're seeing the data providers look at regulatory requirements and disclosures. So again, what are those standardizations along common frameworks? So technology is part of the conversation for sure, but it is probably a trifecta between business, technology, and the consultancies work together to try and solve this.
Okay, thank you very much indeed on that one. Let's run our last audience poll question here, and it asks, what are the challenges of implementing and integrating ESG compliance solutions into your organization's compliance environment? Again, you have choice. So tick the boxes that are appropriate to your organization. And while you do that, if I may come back to Monica to talk from a practical perspective about how best compliance solutions can be implemented and integrated into existing environments and provide a positive customer service. Obviously, as Sean said, tech isn't all of it by any means, but you do need some tech to get through so much data and so many requirements.
Yeah, I'll actually like to start off with the data to an extent, because the regulators are now asking for certain types of data. So, for example, in the UK, the FCA is asking for Scope 3 data starting with this financial year. Scope 3 data is almost entirely modelled and is very rarely actually available from companies. So from an investment perspective, a lot of it is proxy information. So yes, technology can be very useful, but technology also needs to be useful in distinguishing between which data is reported, actual measured data, which data is estimated. So whilst we are responding to the regulator with the best information available, we're very clear about how we need to improve the quality of the data we're using and the quality of the disclosures we're making. And I think that's one of the challenges in actually integrating, because the need to comply is driving disclosure. The lack of clear-cut information, the lack of measured information, the need for benchmarks is one of those things that are difficult to use. However, having said all of that, I do think even with proxy data, you can still take the pulse of what you're doing. And that is very much, in my view, the intention of regulators for pushing for sustainability disclosures. So it is possible, even with proxy data, to start thinking about risk management. How do you do a no regrets investment decision? Well, I mean, you could kind of know that if you invest in a coal company, it's probably a regrets decision. What is a no regrets decision? Are there certain parameters, even using proxy data, that you can incorporate in your risk management? So the regulator is giving you a bit of support here in asking the universe around you to start reporting that data. But whilst you're waiting for it, you can start building it into risk management frameworks in your internal reporting, in your remuneration. You can start thinking about, well, what does that mean for your own transition plan? And thinking through, how do you become resilient as a business? You don't need perfect data to be able to start incorporating. What you do need is a clear understanding. This is the first cut, and you're going to have to revisit and revisit and revisit to improve and clarify all of those niggly bits that you can't get to the bottom of at the moment.
Okay, thanks, excellent. And Sean Vickers, how do you see this, and as much as the data, the integration, bringing it all together to get to risk positions and things like that?
Yeah, And I think Monica's done a fantastic job of answering this question, so I'll try and fill in the gaps in between. There's certainly, if we look at where ESG is and we look at regulations that are coming the past, there is a fundamental issue around if we get this wrong, what that means in making the reporting right at whatever level we report this at, whatever EXCO, whatever risk committee. So it has to be something that is active and living. It can't be something that's stale, that is locked. This will constantly evolve. We may start by proxying, but that proxying will tighten and we will start to get better and better data and therefore be able to make better and better decisions. So I generally don't think, like other regulations, this is going to be a one and done. I think it will be something that will evolve.
Okay, excellent.
I would just add to that, Sarah, briefly if we have time, I would agree with what was said there. I think data is really key. And, to a certain extent, the activities of financial institutions is the sum of the activities of their clients. So being able to understand, get the right data, understand where that data came from when interacting with the client is really key. In terms of actually embedding that into existing compliance processes, what we're seeing an awful lot with clients is to make that a consolidated process. So if we're doing an onboarding, if we're doing a maintenance or a periodic review or whatever it might be, the answer is not to have a KYC process and then an ESG process and then a risk assessment process, but to bring those together, to keep the efficiency up, to keep the client touch points to a minimum, and then to treat ESG basically as just a different type of risk to a certain extent, another flavor of due diligence, which can then inform each other. So, we'll have AML risk for a customer, but we'll also have, say, climate risk or reputational risk, and ultimately an ESG rating. And by, weaving those ESG obligations through existing compliance processes, there's a compounded value because we're reusing teams, we're reusing data, and we're reusing processes. And then I would echo what Sean said, like the change management, this is just really key. So being, from a technology perspective, being able to adapt to that quickly, there's the regulations themselves need to mature. There's almost a societal maturing or like an industry maturing as firms get more used to providing this information. Like for Fenergo, when we started being asked ESG questions, we had to find out how to answer questions around, well, how many of our flights each year were to which jurisdictions and air miles and all that kind of stuff. So I think firms will get more used to being able to provide this information themselves, which will improve the quality of data. But both in terms of what kind of questions we're asking and also what different sources we get data from will just continuously evolve.
Okay, that's great. Maybe we see the poll results, and Dara, having commented on that, perhaps you'd like to walk us through these in terms of the integration issues.
Yeah, the fragmented compliance environment, look, I think we've talked about that a bit. There's what does compliance mean? Like by jurisdiction, by business line, by maturity of the existing regulation. Firms may not know straight away what regulations they're in scope for when it comes to the standards, which ones most closely align with their own worldview and risk appetite. And then, to be honest, you get into pretty standard implementation issues for technology software. So legacy systems and data silos. I think probably a lot of people on this webinar have been talking about that for years, if not decades. It's tough to change these systems. ESG is a little bit of an advantage that it's a new thing, but if we're adding that into existing processes, that's still a big change, both technically and in terms of the teams on the ground. The interesting one there is the lack of skills and resources. So one of the reasons that I was just referring there to it being important to kind of embed these into consolidated, onboarding or maintenance processes rather than having separate ESG processes, is that even if the budget was there to try and have separate teams, you won't be able to find the analysts for it. These are skills that are thin on the ground. And you may even try and solve a compliance problem by creating an operational expense problem because they're also expensive. So, doing this in a digitized fashion, doing this in a consolidated fashion using up-to-date tech instead of building on legacy systems, that's gets you around the technical problem. And then there's also the challenge of knowing which parts of the regulations are relevant, knowing which standards are most pertinent, which ones most closely align with the firm. So yeah, a good spread of challenges there.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to our audience for voting. And Monica, may I come back to you to describe a sample scenario of ESG compliance in action? Obviously, it's got to be quite short, and it could be quite long.
Well, no, I can keep it quite short, but the very common example is incorporating in your disclosures, whether that's in a separate report, sustainability report, general report, TCFD recommendations, given that quite a lot of jurisdictions, the regulators have picked up TCFD as the framework to use. I think that's one relatively easy and very complicated example at the same time, because it has lots of implications. I think one element that comes into play on the compliance side is what is the level of assurance or comfort you can give to the user. That, for example, in this particular case of the TCFD report, and that's one other area where I think technology can increasingly help to validate data across work streams. Another example would be developing scorecards and assessments at the point of investments coming into your world. So, for example, in our case, Aviva Investors has developed an ESG scorecard that seeks to collect information that's later going to be used in SFDR assessment, so the principal adverse indicators process. So thinking through what is the regulator requiring and thinking about where can you fruitfully incorporate it into a process without disrupting the process too much. So yes, it's an additional layer of due diligence, but if you're already doing due diligence, then use the existing process and enhance the process. It's perhaps the best way to go.
Thank you. Sean Vickers, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think where we're seeing kind of success in this space, especially in financial services, is when we're seeing, well, it's baby steps, Sarah, but we're seeing organizations, and particularly financial services organizations, embed ESG, as Dara's mentioned, into their onboarding story. So it's not seen as something that's othered or atomized. It's completely embedded within a process, because at the end of that, there is some form of client experience. So what we have seen are organizations at this stage understand what the standards are with which they're working to, understanding the disclosures which they need to report, and then from an end-to-end perspective, looking at how that sits within their onboarding journey rather than another regulation that needs to be repapered or needs to be outreach to. So that's where we're starting to see some success within the industry.
Okay, great. Thanks very much indeed, both of you. And let's take a break now for some audience questions. We have quite a few, so let's see how many we can cover. And Sean Taylor, I'm going to put the first one to you. It says, do the speakers believe that the FCA's higher thresholds for sustainability labelling compared to SFDR will have an impact on the UK market competition? And will we see the pool of sustainable investment products diminish in the UK?
Well, excellent question, and also a massive topic to answer. But to unpick it slightly, the labelling piece and the FCA view on it, I can see why the FCA are doing it. They want us in the UK in particular, seeing as we're still without a post-Brexit agreement and such forth. We want to be the leaders in this. They want us to be seen to be the anti-greenwashers. The big washing. They don't want us to be seen as the laundry anymore. I can see why they would do it. I think there is an intense pushback coming through from the trade bodies. I'm part of the one from the PIMFA trade pushback on it. And I think there'll be a meeting of the minds where it'll be dialed back ever so slightly. And again, as Dara and Sean Vickers said earlier, I think the impact that will have is that people will see this as a safe zone to come into. So whilst it may appear uncompetitive, I think ultimately it will make us possibly the go-to place, because when people like Sean are looking at the onboarding and Dara and Fenergo on their piece, and then if you take Monica in the insurance, then we'll all be working to the same common set of data. And right now we don't have that. At least they're doing something that to make us all on the same playing field, and then it'll be down to us to work out how actually which end we go from first and how we play on that field. Thank you.
Okay, Thank you. We've spoken about global firms. Can I bring this one to you, Monica? And it says, does the panel consider that organizations are better placed to have a global head of ESG or to break down responsibility across different accountable executives?
So I sit in a fairly complex organisation where we've got asset owner, we've got different insurance businesses, where we've got different locations, where we've got an asset manager within the group. And whilst there is a sort of simplicity to thinking, we can have a group head, every business, every unit has a slightly different perspective, slightly different take. The way we're regulated as an insurance company is somewhat different than what FCA expects of Aviva as a PLC. So I think realistically, you do need functions particularly across global organizations, that take the local view, so to speak, and adapt to the use case that is relevant to the business. It's being sensitive to the fact that different units, different business units, different regional units can have a different role to play. But there is an element of, can you productively do things centrally? For example, data might be something that you can do centrally, but responding to regulatory requirements probably does require a differentiated approach. So I think it's thinking about what would that head be responsible for? And maybe there are certain things that would make sense.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, here's one for you, Darren. I'm not sure if it's easy to answer. It says, to what extent should companies be held accountable for the indirect environmental and social impacts caused by their suppliers or business partners throughout the value chain? This is also a hot topic, isn't it? It's all very well being good in your part, but what about everybody else in the chain?
Yes, I think there's a move towards that. So, right now the focus is very much on, say, a firm being able to describe its own performance from an ESG perspective. So, this will be for a variety of reasons, but there may be, say, at the simplest level, a reputational concern that they want to be seen to be oftentimes the greenest operator in their industry, if not the most socially conscious and most transparently governed. That will start to bring in more of the supply chain. I think it's already a risk, so I think the regulation standards will follow this. But, if you're the squeaky clean operator and then you're doing business with a firm who may have anything from strike breaking to child labor to an overly high proportion of workplace fatalities, that'll get found out quite quickly. So I think
definitely come out in the KYC, right, Dara?
Sorry, say it again.
It's going to definitely come out in the KYC.
That's it, yeah, a lot of stuff will.
Yeah.
And there's an overlap there as well. So there's almost a putting yourself forward as a paragon of virtue in this area can then set you up for some of those gotchas a little bit. And look, I think it just goes back to that point of this needing to be real, that it's not just the sheen as Sean described it, that, this needs to be embedded in the value of your company, that this needs to be embedded throughout your supply chain, which is really tough. Getting a diversified, probably globalized supply chain to provide all this information isn't easy, but KYC isn't easy. And the goal here is to kind of move the dial. Held accountable is a tough one. I think they'll be held accountable by their customers, by the investors, by their employees. How that translates into some kind of obligation or cost is trickier. But I think certainly firms will be judged not only by their own actions, but by that of their supply chain.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And Sean Vickers, coming to you next. As a relatively small asset manager, ESG is a big investment. How can we approach this in incremental steps?
Great question. I think, like any project, understand what the end-to-end looks like and then do it in little bits. So what's going to create the biggest bang for your buck? What's going to be able to allow you to report in numerous ways, in the quickest way? What's going to be the smartest way with which you can embed ESG into an existing process? So I think digital journey end-to-end and how it sits in that digital journey, rather than I have to build a brand new process with brand new systems, is probably a more efficient way from a cost perspective to tackle this. Because otherwise you will build an entirely separate function to do something that should be embedded, and therefore you won't realize the true benefits, which are the differentiation and growth that you can get from ESG.
Okay, fantastic. And coming back to you, Dara, the panel talks about ESG as a growth opportunity. What's the real potential?
There's a few different areas, I think, for this. So something that was referenced earlier is talent. So just to start at maybe the slightly less direct ones, but firms, employees want to work for firms whose values align with their own. So and maybe less so these days, where there's some downsizing going on and correction in certain industries, but still, like finance is a people business, technology is a people business. So being able to attract the best people is key for growth, and then being able to demonstrate values that align with those of your workers will reap dividends. And the same obviously goes for customers. So there's a reputational, they call it a marketing element to this, that the most socially conscious, the greenest bank in the world will be able to do better with their customers. But then more directly, there's things like Capital 501A leniency for a more green tilted spread, that where there could be lower capital requirements. But I think the real one is in green lending and green products. So being able to show that there's a better mortgage rate available to houses that meet certain criteria, that certain industries are more favorably treated, that access to funding is higher for certain industries, and avoiding other ones like coal. That is in itself tough. Like, for example, if you're saying, okay, well, we're not going to do business with oil refineries, but then actually they're looking for a loan that will make the oil refinery more efficient because they'll use more effective drills. Is that green or is that not? Technically it's a reduction in emissions. So it's not as simple as saying, oh, well, just issue green loans and that's the growth opportunity. It is a complex area, but there's massive opportunities there. And the final one that I would say is being more aware of ESG as a risk. So, if we think of longer term assets of real estate projects, and there is a climate risk to those. So if we think of something like building apartments where I'm in Ireland, down in the south around Cork, some of those areas will be underwater in 50 years. So there's a kind of a threat to the value of that asset over a longer time frame. So both in terms of directly generating revenue, in terms of protecting revenue and protecting reputation, and ESG has a part to play in all of that. I suppose it's more than just do the right thing. It's do well and do well and do good, as they say.
Okay, thank you. We'll have to leave the audience questions there. We do have a few more, but I'll gather them up and send them to Fenergo. And if you put your name on them, they may be able to help you to answer them. So thank you very much indeed to our audience for your questions and to our speakers for your answers. And coming back to my questions, and let me come to Sean Vickers to tell us about the benefits of getting ESG compliance right and the penalties of getting it wrong.
Yeah, it's a good one. And I think we may have covered some of the ground here, Sarah, but certainly the benefits are through client experience. So if we think about what's happening out there, if you can get this right, and if you see it beyond the green sheen, as Sean Taylor has described, there is differentiation and growth. Now, often in the industries that we work in, that's what people are looking for, differentiation and growth. ESG can be that factor. So, I think there was a report written in 2022, which is a benchmark for sustainable banking, that said 97% of business executives believe that the future is around sustainable digital journey. This is a classic example of us being able to grasp a sustainable digital journey from the get-go. So, we're not messing up a process, or we're not adjusting a process. We can build something from the get-go that aligns to that ambition. And I do genuinely believe, having worked in this industry for 25 years, that is a true differentiator. On the flip side, I think if you don't get this right, and I think Dara touched on this, it comes back to something internal. So it's reputational risk. So how does your teams feel about it? What does that say about the culture of your organization? What does that say about your own organization? What does that say about attracting talent? So, for me, I really believe that ESG is a game changer in the market if it's done right and approached in the right way.
Okay. Dara, would you add to that?
Yeah, I think Sean hit the major points. The only thing I would add is, I suppose the benefit to getting it right is really making a difference. To be cheesy about it for a moment, like the kind of changes that need to happen at an infrastructure scale for for wind farms, for divestment away from fossil fuels, won't happen without finance. So this is really key to make these progressive changes. And there is an opportunity there for better customer experience, to do it cheaply, or more cheaply, for it to be a revenue raiser. But I think the piece on getting it wrong is, these are mandatory compliance obligations, and the risk to get them wrong is being in breach, is potentially fines. We're starting to see greenwashing fines come in. I think the Goldman Sachs had some last year. So I think that will start to bite a little more, as was the case with KYC. So I think when we see a bit more of that coming through, that'll kind of start to show the teeth of ESG a little bit more, I suppose.
Certainly will. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. So finally, I'd like to ask all our speakers some advice for practitioners working on ESG regulatory compliance. We've covered a lot, so let's try and sum some of that up. Sean Taylor, would you like to
Three things. I actually wrote 3 things down as we're going along, and I think on the back to Dora's point, we can never underestimate, if we don't do this right, what shareholders will do to a company that doesn't. So 1, stay informed and updated. It's an ever-changing landscape. 2, do really good materiality assessments with multidisciplinary teams. You can't just do this one business, or compliance on its own, or legal on its own, or finance on its own. Multidisciplinary. And the 3rd thing I'd say is establish really good governance and internal controls around how you do it. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sean. Sean Vickers.
Yeah, so I think 3 things from my side are: technology is fantastic, but it's not everything. So there's a wider conversation here that needs to be had across the industry. The second thing is, if you get this right, it is a differentiator, not only for the wider environment, but also for customer experience. So it is a differentiator, and it will drive growth. And my 3rd thing is, if you get this wrong, yes, there are fines, and yes, there are impacts from a monetary perspective, but it will ultimately damage your organization.
Okay, Monica.
Picking up on some of the previous comments, I think one of the big opportunities here is to tell your story. So yes, there can be greenwashing or claims of greenwashing, but there's a new term called green hushing, where you're actually not presenting your story for fear of somebody calling it greenwashing. Be careful, obviously, you don't want to be greenwashing, but providing transparency and telling your story it is very beneficial. I think the other aspect is think about what governance actually means. Yes, it does mean governance means signing off on aspects, but it's also making sure that people have the knowledge to be able to take a view, to be able to sign off. And I think one key aspect that we haven't really talked about much is bringing up the level of knowledge within your organization, so they understand the topics and they can have a more holistic view of risks and opportunity, not just strictly related to compliance, but sustainability more broadly. And I'll leave it at that, because I think we're coming up to time.
We are, but first, a few last words from Dara, please.
Yeah, I think the guys hit most of it. All I would add to that is I'd echo the staying on top of regulations is really key. So just, both for where we are today with the published regulations and standards, but also the changes that we've talked about so far. So having a strategy to be able to kind of get it right today, and then also be able to absorb those updates, and then to look to technology to take the pain out of it, I suppose. So like a lot of what we talk today can sound scary, awful lot of acronyms, a lot of processes, opportunities for growth, but also there's some risks in there. And technology, as Sean says, won't solve everything, but it helps with that automation. It can make it a lightweight process. It can make sure that your customer journey isn't negatively impacted. So looking to the right partners there is important too.
Okay, thank you, Dara, and then thank you all very much indeed for sharing your experience and expertise today. Thank you to Fenergo for sponsoring today's webinar. I would add that Fenergo has produced an ESG readiness assessment that will let you determine how prepared your organization is to meet the ESG challenge. It's free, easy to complete, and it's a 5-minute quiz that guides you through a few questions looking at readiness across regulations and standards, data strategy, operating model, and managing policy. The assessment will be out soon, and Fenergo will send it to everybody who's on this call today, so you can have a go and get back to them and tell them how it's going and find out for yourselves how you're doing, I hope. So that's a great thing. Watch out for that. And finally, just before we close, a few 18 group webinars that may be of interest to you. You can see them on your screen. We're 25th of May, we'll be talking about FRTB implementation in APAC. 13th of June, how to optimize and streamline regulatory reporting using outsourced and managed services. And on the 15th of June, back to ESG and ESG standards and taxonomies, a progress report. So we may have progressed a little bit from today. Let's see on the 15th of June. That said, that's it for today. So thank you again to Monica, Dara, Sean Taylor, and Sean Vickers. And thank you to all of you who've taken part in the webinar. Please complete our feedback form, as we're always keen to hear your views and improve our products. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.
Thanks, Sarah.
Sarah.